Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker, the committee has considered the Court's remote participation bill and reports it with amendment. Mr Speaker, I move that the report be adopted.
The question is that the report be adopted. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The bill is set down for third reading next sitting day. Call Government Order of the Day number 3.
Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill, adjourned debate on third reading.
Third reading. Jo Goodhue has the call. She doesn't wish to take it. Sue Williams-Seo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm happy to make a contribution to the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill 2009. Mr Speaker, my parents and uncles and aunt belong to a generation who in the late 1960s and early 1970s were able to purchase their first 3 or 4 bedroom home in working class suburbs such as Grey Lynn, Ponsonby and later in Otara, Orohuhu, Mangere and Papatoetoe for roughly around the price of $9,000 to $15,000 per house. And they were able to do this while they worked for the factories that lined the streets of Penrose, Mount Wellington, Ellerslie, and in the freezing works in Orohuhu. And also due to the support of the Housing New Zealand loans, which at that time charged 3% per annum for a 30-year mortgage, similar to USA mortgages today, not the 8% that banks charge today for 3 to 5 years. Today, home ownership is almost an impossible goal for many families. And I suspect, member here, the Honourable George Hawken, Ross Robertson and others in similar communities will feel the struggle that families are encountering. That same 3-bedroom house in Mangere today is now valued around $300,000 to $400,000. And a family would need to be earning roughly about $124,000 to make weekly payments, mortgage payments of about $500 or $600 per week to maintain a $300,000 or $400,000 mortgage. And in a working class community such as Mangere, where the median income is about $20,600 per year, where 81% of that population earn less than $40,000 a year, owning their own home is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that those working families now face. And many of those families will be forever bound to the hip of a landlord, and the statistics show renters number now about 1 million, and those numbers are rising. But, sir, having a house is a basic human right. It is a basic human right to have a roof over one's head and to have shelter for that person and their family. And yet, because of economic circumstances, low wage rates, high unemployment, particularly under this government, increasing cost of living, increasing GST, lack of educational opportunities due to funding cuts, many families in these working class communities do not have control over their economic circumstances and therefore no control over securing this basic human right for themselves and their families. And it does not help that the national government has decided to axe the Housing New Zealand Shared Equity Scheme, which my colleague and the opposition spokesperson on housing, Moana Maki, has called short-sighted. It seems the government will stop funding the Shared Equity Scheme from July 1st, tomorrow that is. Shared equity is an important part of the housing affordability mix in many other countries, and it seems the Minister Heatley promised before the 2008 election that he would continue with shared equity at least until his long-awaited Gateway Affordable Housing Initiative was available. But Budget 2010 contained no funding for this so far mythical scheme. The bill on the table, sir, is to amend the Residential Tenancies Act 1986 and other legislation to adopt the law to significant changes in the structure and dynamics of the residential rental market, which have taken place since the Act came into force. And the fact that the number of people living in rental housing has increased with a corresponding decline in home ownership rates. The particular aim of this legislation is to encourage the development of a rental market that provides stable, quality housing to those who rent their homes, to enable landlords to manage their properties more effectively, and to clarify and appropriately balance the tenant-landlord rights and obligations. And I want to acknowledge the fact that this work began under my colleague Marion Street, the former Minister of Housing. Labor welcomes the much-needed updating of our residential tenancy laws, but believes that this Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill is also a missed opportunity for government to fairly protect the interests of the more than 1 million tenants in New Zealand. People who are long-term renters want stability and certainty in their lives and the ability to put down some roots. This is important for our communities and especially for families, so that children don't have to be moved from school to school. And having long-term, reliable tenants is also important for property owners who want their investment looked after. And while Labor supports much of this bill introduced under the previous Labor government, we do have some concerns around some of the changes made to the bill by this national government. And these concerns were raised by submitters, which Labor reflected in its minority report. The first concern that I raise is the termination of tenancy for provision of short-term accommodation for major events. Labor is disappointed, Mr. Speaker, that the national government voted down an amendment to residential tenancies legislation that would have prevented tenants being evicted from their homes so that landlords could rent the properties out during major events. Moana Maki's amendment to the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill would have prevented the eviction of a tenant from any rental property, including boarding houses, for the purpose of making a quick buck, providing short-term accommodation during major events such as the Rugby World Cup. Earlier this year, boarding house tenants were evicted en masse so that their rooms could be used during the Wellington Sevens. This put enormous pressure on social services and emergency accommodation providers, which struggled to cope with the displaced and vulnerable people. There are already concerns in Auckland that the same thing is going to happen next year during the Rugby World Cup, especially with hotels charging such high prices. My colleague Moana Maki spoke to the Minister months ago and alerted him to this issue. He chose to do nothing about it himself and then voted against Labour's attempt to rectify the problem. Another area of concern is cleansing orders. The government removed the requirement for landlords to disclose to tenants when a cleansing order has been issued for a property. They said that cleansing orders, for example, on a house used to manufacture methamphetamine, are already legally required to be listed on the LIM report, which can be accessed by the potential tenant, and that the Tenancy Tribunal considers the letting of contaminated houses to be a breach of the Principal Act. However, the reality of this change is that it places the onus on every single tenant to access the LIM report for a property they wish to lease on the off chance that it may have been contaminated by the manufacturing of P. This is unrealistic, especially given the cost of obtaining a LIM report, which can be several $100s. Questions also still exist about the consistency of council practices when it comes to cleansing orders and their attachment to the LIM report. Given these concerns, sir, we feel the protection of tenants should be paramount and the clause should be reinstated. Unfortunately, this government voted it down. Labor wanted to limit the requirement to disclose cleansing orders to those imposed in the last 5 years. The original bill did not impose a time limit. The final comment I want to make in an area that is of concern to me is requiring key money prohibited. Labour's proposal to prohibit the collection of key money would have removed a significant upfront financial barrier to some tenants finding private sector accommodation. It would have reduced the need for benefit advances to cover letting fees and ease the pressure on social housing from those who cannot afford the upfront cost of a bond, advance rent and letting fee. Currently, to rent a 3-bedroom home in Mangere, that would be about $350 a week if you were lucky. Landlords want 4 weeks bond plus the first week rent in advance